This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you for joining us today. This is Gina Van Ness with UFS, and today we are going to be discussing one of our best practices for creating a new business online client. So we have a process that we recommend that you use, and it would be using the feature called New Client Using Existing Client. However, with the new Access Manager user interface, they do have a new client onboarding process as well, and you're more than welcome to use that process if that is your preference. We have found over the course of time in training our banks that it seems to be a bit more streamlined and a little more efficient to create what we call a sample client that will have all of the specs that you would set up most often for a client. So when you go to create a new client, then you have all of your specs and everything already set. And if for some reason that there is deviation to that, then you can simply check those fields. When you go through the new user interface client onboarding process, there will be more clicking and more pages that you have to navigate through. But again, go ahead and try both processes and determine which one is more comfortable for you. So I'm going to switch over to a document that will also be available to you that will kind of walk through what this process is. So let me bring this over here. And what I like to do is first talk a little bit about what the hierarchy of Access Manager is. So we have our different levels within Access Manager. Our highest level is the client. Then we have the client account, the employees, and the employee account. And we like to use this diagram of an inverted pyramid to give you the idea that anything that you could possibly offer the users under a client has to be turned on at that highest level, the client level. So everything is turned on there, and then you can get more restrictive in their accessibility as you go down through each of these levels. Now, in between a couple of these levels, we have display groups, if your bank chooses to use those. Those really are nothing more than column headings and ways to group accounts. As an example, you could group all of your checking accounts together, all of your savings accounts together. You could group them under categories or column headings of assets and liabilities. Or let's say the business has multiple properties and perhaps they would like all of their accounts grouped together by property. You could have a column heading with each of the property names. So those are just some examples of how you can use display groups. And then you'll also want to create transfer templates, especially if you have customers using business mobility and them wanting to make transfers through business mobility. So here we are in our navigation menu within Access Manager, and this is the updated Access Manager user interface. So the colors are a little bit different than what you might be used to, but this is what it'll look like. The options within the menu are currently the same as what you would expect today. So with this, my screen prints here are showing you all of the specs that would be in place for this sample client. So we're going to pretend that we've already got our sample client created, and when we are going to create a brand new client, we are going to select this new client using existing client radio button, and then we would browse out using our search criteria off on the right to find our sample client to copy. We simply click on them and it will bring up the new client screen. So let's walk through each of these sections here. So you're definitely going to need a client number, and the bank can determine what that is. Many of our institutions use the portfolio number as their client number. Some banks will use a tax ID number, and other banks just generate random numbers or sequential numbers and assign those to their clients. So you'll also need to include the name of the client, obviously, the address, city, state, and zip. You'll also want to include the tax ID code or tax ID number along with the tax ID type. So likely that's going to be your EIN. So that's the new client section. The next section is the overrides section, and your default client role may be different than what you see here, but that is something that we can certainly discuss specific to your institution if you have questions there. But typically, whatever role you're going to be using most often is what you would have assigned to your sample client. Under the codes section, you really don't need to worry about anything here in this section. If you have multiple branches and you want to assign this client to a particular branch, you may want to select the branch dropdown and select that. But anything referencing a theme number is not applicable, so you don't have to worry about that. Under the account options section, I would recommend that you set your fields just like how they are displayed here. So inquiry detail is just that they can inquire into the account. If they should be able to see presentments, transactions, as well as exporting transactions into Excel, or if your bank is set up to allow customers to export transactions into the Quicken and QuickBooks format, the client level would need to have this marked as yes. The account number display, we can set it to yes, but it's not applicable. The next two sections actually go together, and these determine the balance that is going to be displayed to the customer. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is in that first account activity options section, we have a ledger memo balance. And then under the available balance options, we have an available memo balance. I have seen many institutions where they have a yes in both of those areas. Well, those are two different balance types. So if you had yes in both of those areas, what will actually display is available memo. And so I have that noted here. Available memo would trump ledger memo, but it's best practice to actually just indicate yes for the type that is actually in use. So as an example, in this screen print, we're using available memo. We've got that indicated as yes. And so we can then add in additional items to be reflected in the balance. I don't typically see banks using float in their balances, so that one is marked as no, but I do see them including holds into their balances and pending transfers. If they have a corresponding line of credit, you could also have that included in the balance. However, the sweep amount, I would always recommend this be set at no. If the customer truly has a sweep account, those will function as normal in the nightly update should the accounts need funds. This particular sweep amount, if set to yes, and a customer were doing activity within online banking, and the system thinks that it may need funds as part of, a transfer that they may be attempting, it will actually transfer those funds during the day. And when you would go to look at reports, it's going to make it look like the customer actually initiated that transfer. So to alleviate any sort of confusion, I highly recommend that you always leave the sweep amount set to no. The next section is with respect to service charges. So we aren't going to go into service charges in this particular video. However, you can review your current service charge plans in Access Manager if you go to your menu under Fees and Legacy Service Charge Plans. The next section is multi-factor. So I would say that you could pretty much leave device print, which is your security question and answers, here at the client level. As you get further down into your levels, when you get to the employee level, that's where you can actually assign tokens. So whether the customer is using a hard or soft token, you can indicate that at the employee level. The next section is IP whitelisting. That's not something that's currently in place, so that section is not applicable. If your institution is licensed for business mobility, go ahead and check the box here at the client level. If this box is not checked, but you check it at the employee level, the customer or the employee is not going to be able to see it, because if you remember our inverted pyramid, we need to have things turned on at the highest level in order for them to function at the lower levels in that hierarchy. Administration options, that is usually non-applicable. I only have a couple of banks that would be using this, and what that is in reference to is if you had an agreement with one of your clients and you allow them to create additional users to access business online banking, they would actually have access to some of your Access Manager screens. So again, that's not something I see very often, but it is something that is an option. So if you have questions on that or would like further information, just let us know. Under the approval options sections, for the review stop payments and review internal transfers, if you have those set to yes, that means that the bank actually has to approve them. And the feedback that I've gotten from most institutions is that they don't want those stopped. If the client is requiring dual control between their users, meaning that one user could place a stop payment, but another user under the client would have to approve it, that can happen, but then once that approval is done, then it just goes through. There wouldn't need to be any other sort of bank intervention. So I typically am seeing that these first two options are going to be set at no. I just referenced dual control. So let's say as an example, you have a client and they do in fact want that dual control. Let's say that they are performing internal transfers and they want to make sure that somebody else at the client approves that transfer before the transfer actually goes through. Again, this is the client level, so we need to have approved transfers turned on at this highest level so that when we get to the other levels, we can set the appropriate fields to allow the users to have that capability. The bill payment options section, we're currently going to leave that as is, as well as the merchant capture section. Now, here is a good time to state that another best practice that we recommend is that when you have a new client coming to your financial institution, that you come set up their client, their accounts, and their users all at one time, but don't add in additional products here just yet. So whether they have bill pay, merchant capture, ACH manager, positive pay, wire manager, whatever other product they're going to have access to, if you try to incorporate all of that into the client onboarding itself, I tend to see banks struggle with that. They'll forget pieces. It just becomes a little bit too overwhelming. So our recommendation again is create your client and users from start to finish. Then, based on the products that your customers are going to contract for, get out that specific documentation and come add those products to the client and the users one by one. That is going to be your most efficient way of setting up all additional products. The next section is stop payments. So if you're going to allow your customers to do stop payments, we have to turn it on here at this highest level. So inquiry and add would be set to yes. Then we have our item stop receipt. So there's two different options. We have authorization and authorized. Now, authorization is going to mean that the customer logs into business online banking, they place their stop payment, and it goes on the system for the full duration, like 180 days. If you had it set to authorized, that would mean that the stop is going to go on the system for 14 days. You would want to send a notice to the customer to sign and send back to the bank. And once received, you could then go into Navigator and extend the stop pay expiration to be the full 180 days. So typically, I see authorization being used because you've already validated your customer is who they say they are by using their credentials and possibly a token logging into business online. If you want to charge for stop payments, you would select your appropriate method, and likely you're just going to be charging your DDA standard fee, so that could be what you have there in that dropdown. You could also have something called Ebc Stop Payment, so you'll see that as an option in the dropdown as well. What that would be is if you wanted to give your customers a discount for placing a stop payment themselves through online banking versus getting the bank involved to perform the stop payment, you could have a lower fee there. And if that is the case, again, your method is going to be EBC stop payment, and then you would put your appropriate charge there in the charge field. The next section is with respect to your electronic documents. All of the items that are in uppercase are going to be transactional images. So as an example, check images, deposit slip images, loan payment images, and then all of the documents below that are going to be what your particular institution has set up for e-statements. So again, we need to have the items turned on at the highest level so that we can then assign those document types to your users once we get to that point. And then the last section, or one of the last sections on the page, then is going to be transaction codes. You never have to touch anything in this section because all of the TRAN codes associated with online banking transactions are going to be set up in your actual specs behind the scenes. And we will have a separate training on business online specifications as well, so please look for that. Then we've got our interface specifications. So possible interfaces, this is not an all-encompassing list, but just to give you an idea, you could potentially be giving your client access to check-free bill pay, to notify, positive pay, and whatnot. And so if your client and their users should have access to any of those, you would want to make sure that you have the appropriate interfaces selected here. When you get to the very bottom of the client page, you're going to have some additional options. And this will take you through a wizard screen by screen to set up all the additional pieces needed for your client and user setup. So I would recommend that you go ahead and check all of the boxes like you see there. So the first thing that wizard is going to do is it's going to actually bring you to the display groups. Now again, display groups are nothing more than column headings or a way to group accounts together. So typically what I see is display groups created just based on application: checking, savings, certificates, and loans. So if you have a client that wants different column headings, you can certainly indicate those there. And then you'll go ahead and hit next. That will advance you through the wizard, and in the top little banner, you'll see that step 2 was the display groups, which we already completed. And now here we are on step 3, which is the client account search. So there's multiple ways that you can add accounts to a client. You can search by their portfolio number and name line number. You could search by their tax ID number. So let's say they have multiple portfolios, but they are just using one tax ID number. You can pull in all of those accounts from all of those portfolios, or you could add individual accounts. You could just add accounts one by one. So no matter which section that you use, once you enter in your information, you're going to want to click on the little green arrow over to the right, as it will go back to Navigator and validate that it's an open and active account. Also in each of these sections, if you're searching by multiples, so let's say you have a customer that has multiple portfolios, you can certainly put the portfolio number and name line of the one, and then click the add hyperlink, and then add in the next portfolio that they have along with that name number, and so on and so forth for each of those other 2 sections. So once you've pulled in your accounts, we're coming up here to step 4, which is just reviewing or previewing the client accounts. So in this example, I only added one account. I added one individual account, and so it's displaying just that one account. So if you had done a portfolio search and it brought in all of the accounts from the portfolio, you would simply check that you would have a longer list here of your accounts, and you would simply check the boxes for the accounts that should actually be added to the client. That will then bring us into our next page, where you will actually need to set a nickname for each of the accounts that's going to be added. So here, client account nickname, this one happened to be test account, and then the field immediately below that says client account display group. You would drop that down and then put that account in the appropriate grouping based on the display groups that we had just created. The fields that are over on the right-hand side are going to be not applicable here at this point. So these are the only 2 fields that we need to touch in this screen. Next, we're brought to like a confirmation screen, and it's just confirming the accounts that have been added. And that's all that is, and you can hit next. The next item would be this internal transfer template. Again, this is going to be used if you have business mobility customers that are going to want to be doing internal transfers within business mobility. So all you really need to set here in the template, you can just call the description internal transfers. And then the from institution RT number would be your bank routing number. And then same thing over to the right. You don't have to fill in any of the other information unless you are purposefully trying to restrict transfer access, then you could specify a particular from and to account there for business mobility. Okay, so the next section is going to be with respect to roles. So here, what you're going to do is you are going to search by client name or number, so whichever you'd like to search by, and then you're going to select for ACH and wire. For the time being, you're going to set those to none because, again, we don't want to be adding in additional product access just yet. We just want to get our client and our users and the appropriate accounts established. Okay, then again, another one of our best practices is that we are going to have you create this new role. And we're going to have you call it simply Business Online Access. So you'll name it there in the first section. In the second section, you will have your role authority set to user. Your client assignment, that's just going to be the client information. Transaction view, you can have that set to personal financial manager. And then is this going to be the default role? Yes. So that means any additional users created under this client are going to get this particular role. We don't have to worry about the valid access times section, but under the options section, this is where we are going to select the general options for online banking access. So we want to make sure that they can view transactions, retrieve documents, change a password, export transactions, view statements, things like that. But you'll notice that we're not checking merchant capture or mobile merchant capture here at this point. Like we said earlier, if your customer is going to have access to these additional products, we're going to come back and set those up later. This particular role is just for general online banking inquiry access. So once we have that created, we are then brought to our employee record. So this is where we're going to create our first user. So name, we have to give them a name. Security level, if applicable, the only time security level is going to come into play is if your customer is using check-free bill pay or if they're going to be using dual control for transfers, for internal transfers. Otherwise, you can pretty much always leave the security level at employee. Under contact methods, you'll want to make sure that you have an email address. A business phone here at this point is not required. Our screen print happens to have it typed in there, but it is not required here. Under the security section, this is where you're going to establish the user ID that they're going to use to log into business online banking. Now, keep in mind that once you establish this and you save the record, it cannot be changed. So that's different than retail online. Retail online allows you to change the customer's user ID after it's already been set up. With business online, once you establish it, that's what they get unless you delete the user and create it from scratch again. Then you've got your change password link. So this is where you are going to assign that temporary password so that they can actually get into online banking that very first time. With that being said, we're moving down into the multi-factor authentication section. So if the user just has inquiry access only and they're not doing any sort of transactions where money is leaving the bank, you may want to save yourself a token and just leave them set up at device print and just have them enter in answers to security questions when they log in. If that's not the case, and going forward, you are planning on adding additional products where they will have the ability to move money outside the bank, and you do want to add in a token, then you would go ahead and change your device print to one of the appropriate token options and then fill out the other fields appropriately for token type and then token serial number. Okay, Next section is role. Now, this screen print may not apply to you 100%. However, when you created this user, you're going to have a default role that had already come in. So whatever that is, and in this case, it happened to have been full rights role, we are saying that whatever it defaulted in, we're going to remove that, and we're going to add in that business online access role that we just created that is inquiry access only. Then we advance down to the accounts section. So all of the accounts that got added to the client, we now can pick and choose which of these accounts this particular user should have access to. Under funds transfer options, we'll want to make sure that inquire transfers and initiate delete transfers is set to yes, so that they have that ability. Funds transfers, so again, if we had created a template, that would be reflected there. We aren't yet ready to set up bill pay for the customer nor merchant capture. The positive pay section is for an old positive pay product. So if your bank actually offers the exact TMS, that would be set up in a different manner, and this positive pay section is not going to be applicable to you. Stop payments. So in our example, we had allowed stop payments at the client level. So we would actually need to change these fields to mirror what we had set up at the client. So inquiry and new would be set to yes. And the method, if it's the DDA standard or the discounted EBC charge, you would select that appropriately there. The mobile banking section is for an old mobile banking product, so that section is not applicable. And then under electronic documents, you are likely going to match what you had set up at the client level. Now, one little note here is that on the bottom left of this section, there's a couple of asterisks, and it says document disabled at the client. So let's say, for example, you checked a bunch of the boxes here for your document types, but you did end up seeing a couple of asterisks after those document names. That is going to indicate that these documents are not actually turned on at the client level, because again, we have to have everything turned on at the highest level, which is the client, in order for things to function at the employee level. And then as you advance through that screen, it is going to bring you to the confirmation page that shows that the accounts that you indicated have actually been added to the users. Now, let's say that you have additional users to set up under this client. My recommendation is going to be to stop here and actually click the finish button, because you've got this particular employee set up exactly how you wanted to. And at this employee level, there would have been a few fields that we did actually need to touch that did not come down from what we indicated at the client. So once we have this user all set up, we would go back to our menu and we would go under business, employees, and then we're going to do new employee using existing employee. And then all we'll really need to do is put in the customer's name, their user ID, temporary password, and that's pretty much it. So doing it this way is going to be a little bit more efficient and save you some clicks. Now, let's say that we need to, for some reason, restrict some sort of ability within the client accounts. You would then go back into your menu and go to business client accounts and make any sort of adjustments there. And if for any reason you'd need to do further restriction at the employee account level, same sort of thing. You would just go to your menu, go to business, employee accounts, and make any sort of necessary changes there. So that is our best practice for setting up a new business online client. Now, again, this is the process that we typically train on, but there is that newer onboarding process under the dashboard page of the new Access Manager user interface. So try them both out. See which one you would prefer. Our findings are that the new client using existing client, using what we're calling the sample client to copy, that does seem to be the most time efficient. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are always available by email at cs@ufsdata.com. And thank you for your time today.